President Biden is calling for a ban on assault weapons. He's also backing two pieces of legislation passed by the House that would expand background checks. Is there any real chance, though, that Congress will side with the president? Joining me right now is Marc Fisher, senior editor at the Washington Post. Marc, thank you for being here with us. You know how this works. Let's get right to it. These two bills need 60 votes to pass the evenly divided Senate. I think I know the answer here, but maybe it's different. Could that actually happen?
It's hard to imagine, Lorenzo, because as you mentioned, it needs 60 votes. The Democrats have the slimmest of all possible majorities, and so they would need a whole bunch of Republicans to come over to their side. Is that going to happen in this climate, in this divided country? It's hard to imagine. It didn't happen after Newtown, the death of 20 kindergartners. It didn't happen after the Las Vegas or Parkland mass shootings, when we were told that there would be massive movement on guns. And so it's hard to see that happening now.
Yeah, and we're so conditioned to think after these types of shootings that lawmakers won't come together. There won't be some solution. But are there any areas of gun control reform where Senate Democrats and Republicans could agree?
Well, they could. I mean, there are some areas where Republicans have said through the years that they're willing to move, particularly after Newtown and after Parkland. They said that they were open to an expansion of background checks, and then they quickly backed off from that. There's also the possibility of a renewal of the assault weapons ban. It's hard to imagine Republicans coming on board with that because the gun lobby and the gun advocates across the country use the threat of an assault weapon ban to raise money, to win support from people across the country. And so both sides use this issue for political purposes, and that seems to be of more importance to them than actually getting something done.
Right. All right. And with very little expectation that Congress will get anything done, the White House has indicated it is exploring other avenues for gun control, bypassing Congress in this case. What are the president's options?
Well, he's talked a little bit about taking executive orders, taking executive action against gun proliferation. One thing he possibly could do would be to use an executive order to bolster background checks. The other thing he's talked about doing, he promised during the campaign that he would move on day one to repeal the protection that gun manufacturers have against liability for injuries and deaths that result from the use of their products. But he didn't do that on day one. He hasn't done it yet, and that would probably require, almost certainly require a legal law from Congress rather than an executive action. So there's not a lot he can do by himself.
Yeah. All right. Marc Fisher, senior editor at the Washington Post. Thank you for being here with us tonight.